The storm had been relentless all evening. Nate Holloway, a 27-year-old man, sat on his couch in the dim light of his living room, trying to ignore the pounding rain against the windows and the occasional roll of thunder. The world outside seemed to disappear beneath the heavy downpour. His focus was on the TV, a flickering distraction that kept him from thinking about the weird feeling crawling up his spine. Something about tonight felt off, but he couldn't figure out why. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the fact that he was alone in his house, a small, suburban place where everything usually felt so safe. Suddenly, a loud buzz shattered the silence. Nate jumped, his heart skipping a beat. His phone screen lit up with an emergency alert. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was just another test. The message, though, was anything but typical. Emergency alert. Do not look outside. Do not open your doors. It is not human. Stay inside. Nate's stomach dropped. His pulse quickened. It didn't make sense. This had to be some kind of joke, maybe some kind of warning about a prank or a broken alarm system. But still, the words sent a chill down his spine. He looked at the screen again, as if he could make sense of it by reading it a second time. But there it was, clear as day. It didn't make sense, yet the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His instincts told him that this wasn't a prank. Something wasn't right. He scoffed, dismissing the alert as a hoax. But deep down, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. He stood up, his legs a little shaky, and made his way to the window to check outside. The storm raged, the wind howling and rain slashing against the glass. The streetlights, usually a comforting glow, flickered once, twice, then went out all at once. The sudden darkness swallowed everything outside. For a moment, he wondered if the storm had knocked out the power. But something felt different now. The air was unnervingly still, almost too still. Nate's eyes darted across the yard, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Then his gaze froze. Standing in his neighbor's yard was a figure. Tall, thin, unnaturally still. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and it was staring directly at him. Through the window, its gaze was intense, unblinking. Nate's heart thudded in his chest. He couldn't move. It was as though his legs had turned to stone. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the rain, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Nate's mind raced. Who the hell was that? Was it his neighbor or someone else? But no, there was something wrong about it. Something that didn't fit. His body screamed for him to move, but his feet were frozen to the floor. He couldn't look away. The figure was still staring at him, watching him, waiting. Then, a knock. 1, 2, 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, each one louder than the last. Nate flinched, his heart jumping into his throat. He turned away from the window and backed up, his pulse thundering in his ears. Who was at the door? It was past midnight, the storm was unforgiving, and nobody should be out there. A cold sweat began to form on the back of his neck as his feet felt heavy with each step. Should he answer it? Should he ignore it? His mind spun with questions. But then, a deeper, more primal fear settled in. That damn alert. It was clear now. Don't open the door. But the knock was still there. It felt like it was echoing through the house, like it was coming from every corner at once. There was no voice, just the slow, rhythmical sound of knuckles against wood. Nate stood frozen, his hand inches from the door handle. Should he open it? What if it was someone who needed help? What if it wasn't? What if the alert wasn't some mistake? He was on edge now. Every sense heightened, every shadow in his house playing tricks on him. His breath caught in his throat, and he stepped back from the door, his heart racing faster. Was it just his mind playing tricks? Was this really happening? Something was wrong. His instincts screamed it, but there was still that tiny part of him that wanted to believe everything was fine. But deep down, Nate knew. This wasn't a test. It wasn't a joke. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to be there. Another knock, this one louder, more urgent. Nate's legs nearly gave out from under him. The weight of fear pressed down on his chest. There was no turning back now. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew that whatever came next was far worse than anything he could have imagined. All he had to do was open the door. But he couldn't. And somehow, he knew that if he did, everything would change. Nate stood there in the stillness, his hand hovering just above the door handle. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Was it a prank? His gut told him it wasn't, but his mind struggled to keep up. No, this couldn't be real. Someone was messing with him, right? The alert, the figure outside, the knocks, all of it. Maybe he just needed to calm down, call his neighbor, and get some clarity. He grabbed his phone, hands shaking as he unlocked it. He scrolled quickly to Mrs. Calloway's number, his elderly neighbor, hoping she might know what was going on. She would have seen something, wouldn't she? But as the phone rang, his heart sank. No answer. Frustrated, Nate looked around the room. The tension was thick in the air, like the weight of the storm pressing down on him. He glanced at the security cameras, his only hope for figuring out what was happening outside. He clicked the button to load the feed. The screen flickered, then went black for a split second before loading again. The sight that met him made his blood run cold. On the camera feed, Mrs. Calloway stood in her front yard, just like the figure outside Nate's window earlier. But something was off. Her body twitched, jerking in unnatural ways. Her head snapped to the side, as if it were a doll, one of those lifeless toys with stiff joints. A shiver ran down Nate's spine. She didn't move like a person anymore. And then she turned toward the camera. Her eyes locked with his through the lens, but there was no recognition in them, only emptiness. Her face remained frozen for a moment, and then her mouth stretched open impossibly wide, far wider than it should have. It wasn't a grin, but it didn't look like a scream either. It was a gaping, eerie thing that felt wrong in every way. Her eyes, her expression, they were blank, but her smile? That was something else. The screen flickered again. A flash of static blurred her image, and when the feed cleared up, Mrs. Calloway was gone. Just like that. The camera feed cut to static again, and Nate was left staring at a blank screen. His breath caught in his throat, the room suddenly feeling colder. What the hell was that? Was that really Mrs. Calloway? His phone buzzed in his hand, pulling him from the shock of the moment. Another alert. He opened it quickly, hoping it was something that would explain all this. But what he read made his heart race even faster. Do not acknowledge it. Do not let it know you see it. His head spun. What was going on? It was already too late. The whisper slid through the door, a low, haunting sound that shouldn't have been there. The hairs on his neck stood straight. Nate, let me in. The voice. It was his. But it wasn't. The tone was wrong. The way it echoed in the silence, like it was stretching and warping. It sounded distorted, not quite his voice. It shouldn't have been able to carry through the door like that. And yet, there it was. So close, so real. Nate's heart hammered in his chest. He backed away from the door, his legs weak, knees buckling as he stumbled back into the living room. He felt sick. What was happening? Who was that? And why was it using his voice? A sudden, heavy knock at the door made him jump, his body frozen in place. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Then came the sound of the doorknob turning, slowly, painfully slow, as if it had all the time in the world. Even though the door was locked, even though he was standing there, holding his breath, the sound of that turning doorknob was enough to push him to the edge of his sanity. His pulse raced. He had to do something. Anything. But what could he do? What if it was too late? What if whatever that thing was on the other side was already inside his home? He swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. He ran across the room to his phone, needing something, anything to ground him. But the room felt like it was closing in on him. The walls seemed to press tighter with every passing second. It wasn't just the storm outside anymore. The storm was inside, swirling in his chest, making it impossible to think clearly. His fingers hovered over the dial button as he debated whether to call the police. But what would he say? There's something outside my door that isn't human? He wasn't even sure what was happening. Another knock. This time it was louder, like it was a demand, a warning, not a mere request. Nate's breathing grew shallow, each exhale coming faster, panicked. His mind raced, trying to process it all, but all he could think about was that thing on the other side of the door. The voice. Mrs. Calloway. The figure outside the window. The door rattled under another, more forceful knock. This time, the doorknob turned, and Nate could hear the sound of something scraping against the metal, as though something long and thin was reaching for it. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. This was something else entirely. A low hiss escaped from the crack under the door. Nate staggered back, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. The hiss sounded wrong, like the breath of something that didn't belong here. a sound that couldn't be made by a human or any living creature he knew. It was like the sound of something far too unnatural to exist. Nate stood still, his body frozen in place. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his limbs were heavy, as if they were made of stone. The world outside his door had become a nightmare, and he was trapped in it. Then the door swung open, just enough for him to see what was on the other side. At first, all he saw was the shadow, a vague shape standing in the doorway. But then it stepped closer, and his blood turned to ice. It wasn't Mrs. Calloway. It wasn't even human. The thing that stood before him was tall. Too tall. Its limbs were stretched longer than they should have been. Its fingers, no, they weren't fingers anymore. They were thin, like sharp twigs, bent at impossible angles. The face was featureless, or at least the parts that should have been there were missing. No eyes, no nose, just a dark, empty space where a face should be. Nate opened his mouth to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, suffocated by terror. His heart thudded in his chest, pounding so loudly that it almost drowned out the sound of the thing's movement. The thing in the doorway tilted its head, and in that moment, Nate realized it was mimicking the way Mrs. Calloway had moved. The head jerked unnaturally to the side, just like hers did. The movement was mechanical, like the motion of a puppet controlled by invisible strings. But this wasn't a puppet. This wasn't even a thing that belonged in his world. The creature stepped closer, its long fingers scraping along the frame of the door, leaving behind a trail of something dark. Nate's stomach churned, and for a second, his legs gave way beneath him, but he caught himself. He stumbled backward, eyes never leaving the creature as it leaned closer. "Nate?" The voice came again, low, thick with malice. But this time, the voice was different. It was a distorted version of his own voice, warped and twisted like it had been torn apart and put back together. But there was something else too, something he couldn't quite place, as if the voice wasn't just his own anymore. It sounded like it was calling him, urging him. It was a promise, but one laced with something far darker. The thing reached for him. Nate's breath hitched and his body went rigid. Every instinct told him to run, to flee as fast as possible, but his feet were frozen to the floor. The thing's fingers hovered just inches away from his skin, its long, twisted digits stretching toward him. Its touch would be cold. Nate just knew it. He closed his eyes, waiting for it to make contact, for the world to spin into nightmare. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The thing was gone. Nate blinked, his heart hammering in his chest. The door frame was empty, the air heavy with silence. A strange tension hung in the room, as if something was still watching, waiting. Then, breaking the stillness, came the sound that nearly made him jump out of his skin. The landline rang. The phone's shrill ring echoed through the house, sharp and loud. Nate stared at the phone, the old, dusty landline sitting on the counter, a phone he hadn't used in years. It hadn't even been plugged in for months, but there it was, ringing, demanding attention. With shaky hands, Nate reached for the receiver. He brought it to his ear slowly, his throat tight, as if he already knew who or what was on the other end. The voice on the other end was panic-stricken, breathless. It sounded familiar, but distorted, as though the person had been crying, or maybe even screaming. "It's too late, Nate. It's already inside." Nate's blood turned to ice. The words sliced through him like a cold knife, and his legs buckled beneath him. His mind spun, heart pounding in his ears. The thing he had tried to deny, to push out of his thoughts, was real. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside. The phone clicked as the voice went silent. The line went dead. Nate stood there, frozen, staring at the receiver in his hand. He didn't know how long he stood there. Seconds? Minutes? It felt like hours. "It's already inside." The words repeated in his mind like an endless echo, growing louder, more insistent. The thing had made its way inside his home. It was here, in his house. It was no longer just a nightmare. It was real, and it was hunting him. The sudden sound of a loud bang came from upstairs, a thundering crash that sent Nate jumping to his feet, his heart in his throat. He dropped the receiver, the landline falling to the floor with a hollow clatter. Without thinking, he rushed to grab the nearest thing he could find, a wooden baseball bat. The cold wood felt solid in his hands, but his fingers still trembled as he gripped it tight. His mind raced. What should he do? Should he call the police? He quickly checked his phone, But the screen was black. The signal was gone. Of course it was. The thing must have been messing with the electronics, just like it had with the landline. It knew how to control everything to make him feel helpless. Bang! Another crash. A chair falling, the sound of something heavy slamming against the wall. This time it was louder. The house was alive with noise, a chaotic orchestra of destruction. Nate's heartbeat quickened, his throat dry. The thing was up there, making its way toward him. His hands shook as he moved through the house, inching his way forward, the bat held high. He took slow, careful steps, making sure to be as quiet as possible. Every floorboard under his feet creaked and groaned, as if the house itself were giving him away. He moved down the hall toward the staircase, each footstep louder than the last. Then he heard them. The footsteps. They came from above, slow, dragging, unnatural. They didn't sound like someone walking. No, they were heavier, slower, almost like something dragging itself across the floor. Each footstep sent a jolt of terror through Nate's body, and he froze in place. The footsteps stopped. An icy silence filled the house. Not a single sound, nothing. Nate's pulse raced. His breath came in shallow gasps. He wanted to turn around, to run, but he couldn't. His legs were locked in place, his body trembling with fear. And then, from above, a voice came, a whisper, so soft and cold it sent chills down his spine. "Nate, I'm just like you." The words hung in the air, thick with an unsettling familiarity. They echoed through the walls, wrapping around his chest like a vice. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the bat. Was it talking to him? What did that mean? He couldn't tell if the voice was mocking him or offering some twisted kind of comfort. Either way, it didn't matter. The creature, whatever it was, had found him. It was inside. It was closer than ever. Nate moved toward the stairs, one foot in front of the other, his breathing unsteady. The house felt like it was closing in on him. Every step he took seemed to make the walls squeeze tighter around him. He could hear the faint whisper again, almost too quiet to make out. "Nate, I'm just like you." It was closer this time, and Nate's heart skipped a beat. The thing was upstairs. It had to be. He had no choice now. If he was going to face it, he had to go up there, to confront whatever had invaded his home. Slowly, he placed one foot on the bottom step. It creaked loudly beneath him. Nate's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the bat tighter, each step bringing him closer to the source of the whispering. The stairs groaned under his weight, each creak sounding like a thunderclap in the stillness. He reached the top. The hallway stretched out before him, shrouded in darkness. The whispers seemed to swirl around him, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. He could barely make out anything in the blackness, but his senses were on high alert. His eyes scanned the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just silence. Nate's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. His legs shook with fear, but he couldn't stop now. He had to know what was up here. He had to face it. His breath caught as he heard it again, the whisper. "Nate, I'm just like you." He turned toward the source of the voice, his bat raised high, ready for whatever was coming. But nothing prepared him for what he saw next. The hallway mirror, which he had barely noticed before, caught his eye. It was a large, old mirror, framed in dark wood that looked almost ancient. In the dim light, it reflected the hallway behind him, the same one he had just walked through. He glanced at it quickly, just to make sure nothing was there. But then, something felt off. At first, his reflection looked normal. It was just him, standing there, bat gripped tightly in his hands. He sighed in relief. Maybe he was just losing his mind. Maybe it was all in his head. But then, his reflection did something that froze his blood. It grinned. Nate's stomach dropped. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't moved. His lips hadn't even twitched. But the reflection of himself in the mirror was grinning wide, a twisted, mocking smile that made his skin crawl. The smile stretched unnaturally, like it didn't belong. Nate took a shaky step back, his eyes wide, panic rising in his chest. His heart was hammering in his ears as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He blinked, thinking maybe he was imagining it. But when he opened his eyes again, the reflection didn't change. It was still smiling, that horrible grin spread across its face. And then it did something else. The reflection tilted its head. Slowly, almost as if it was studying him, like it was curious about him. Nate's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know whether to run or stay. Every instinct told him to move, to get away from that mirror, but his feet wouldn't budge. The reflection's hand rose, just like his, but it moved differently, jerky, unnatural. It raised its hand, fingers stretching out towards him, reaching for him through the glass. Nate's heart skipped a beat. His reflection was moving on its own, mocking him. It was as if it knew something he didn't. Nate finally managed to step back, his body shaking. He had to get away from it. But before he could turn, a cold, unnatural sensation washed over him. His stomach turned, his hands trembling as the reflection's hand moved closer. And then it happened. The reflection didn't just stay in the glass, it stepped out. Nate's breath hitched as the figure in the mirror slowly, impossibly, emerged from the surface of the glass. The figure, his reflection, stepped out into the hallway, its mouth stretching wide, too wide, like something was forcing it to smile. The grin wasn't just mocking now. It was evil, predatory. Its eyes locked onto Nate's, the look cold and cruel. Nate staggered backward, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His mind was reeling. The thing that stood before him wasn't him, but it was. It was twisted, distorted, and the grin, that grin, he couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The house suddenly felt colder. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as the temperature dropped, the air thick with an eerie chill that made his bones ache. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his skin prickled with an unnatural sense of dread. And then he heard it. The voice. It wasn't coming from upstairs anymore. It was right behind him. You shouldn't have looked. Nate spun around, the bat raised high, but there was no one there. No shadow, no movement, just emptiness. His eyes darted around, frantically searching, but the hallway was as empty as it had been a moment ago. The voice, though, he could still hear it, lingering in his ears, a whisper too soft, too cold to escape. He looked back toward the mirror. The twisted version of him was still there, still grinning, still stepping forward slowly. Every movement it made was smooth, too smooth, like it was part of the shadows that stretched out of the glass. Its eyes never left him. It was getting closer, coming for him. The lights flickered above him, casting erratic shadows along the walls. For a split second, the hallway was plunged into darkness, and Nate felt his heart stop. But then, the lights came back on, dimmer this time, as if the house itself was struggling to stay alive. And there it was. The reflection stepped forward, crossing the line between the glass and the hallway. Nate's eyes widened in horror. What stood before him wasn't just an image of himself. It was a twisted version of him, a dark, malevolent copy, grinning with malice. Its face was stretched, its eyes gleaming with a hunger that made Nate's blood run cold. The thing, his reflection, was smiling. No, grinning, like it was about to feast on him. Nate stumbled backward, his heart racing. His body screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. His mind was consumed with terror, his thoughts frozen in place. The bat shook in his hands, the grip slipping as he tried to raise it higher to defend himself. But it didn't matter. The twisted version of him stepped forward again. Slowly, deliberately, it moved closer. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore. It was right there, inches away from him, grinning wider, its lips curling unnaturally. It was him, and yet it wasn't. It was something darker, something wrong, and it was coming for him. Nate couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He was trapped, locked in a stare with the reflection that was no longer just a reflection. It was something real, something alive. And it wasn't going to stop until it had him. Panic surged through him like a tidal wave. He had to get out of the house. He had to escape whatever this thing was. With a sharp breath, he suddenly broke his gaze from the reflection. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, nearly falling to the floor in his rush to get away from it. His hands shook uncontrollably as he reached for his keys, grabbing them off the counter and running to the door. The door slammed shut behind him as he bolted outside. The cold night air hit his face like a slap, but it was nothing compared to the chill that had settled deep in his bones. His car was parked in the driveway, just a few steps away. He fumbled with the keys, struggling to get the door open as his hands trembled. Finally, he got inside, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. He needed to leave. He couldn't stay there. His foot pressed down on the gas, and the car jerked forward. He didn't care where he was going, just anywhere but that house. The wheels spun, and he quickly pulled out of the driveway, his eyes darting nervously to the empty street ahead. But when he looked around, something felt wrong. The streets were empty, completely empty. No cars, no people, not a single soul in sight. There was an eerie silence that hung in the air, heavier than the weight of his panic. His heart thudded in his chest as the quiet seemed to swallow him whole. As he drove further into the town, the feeling of unease only grew. The streetlights overhead flickered, one by one, until they all went dark. The glow from the headlights was the only light cutting through the darkness. The streets felt deserted, lifeless. The stillness in the air was unnatural, like time itself had frozen. Every inch of the town felt wrong, twisted in some way that Nate couldn't explain. He glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something familiar. But all he saw was the empty road stretching behind him and the overwhelming silence. And then he saw them. Figures, standing still on the sidewalk. At first, Nate thought they were people, but as he drove closer, he realized something was wrong. These figures weren't moving. They were perfectly still, like statues, frozen in place. They were standing there in odd positions, some facing the street, others facing away. But then it hit him. Their faces. Nate's heart skipped a beat. The faces weren't human. They were blank, smooth, featureless faces, like mannequins. No eyes, no mouths, no noses, just an empty, smooth surface. And they were staring at him. The car slowed to a stop as Nate's hands gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He didn't know what to do. The figures didn't move. They just stared, their blank faces locked on him. It was like they were waiting for something, like they were watching him, following his every move. The air in the car felt suffocating. Nate's breath came out in quick gasps, his panic rising. He needed to get out of there. But before he could do anything, his radio crackled to life, making him jump in his seat. It was just static at first, a buzzing, uncomfortable noise that made his skin crawl. And then through the static, a whisper came. "Turn around. You're not in your town anymore." The voice was low, distorted, almost like it wasn't meant to be heard. It sent a chill straight to Nate's spine. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely grip the wheel. But he quickly tried to turn the car around. But no matter what he did, no matter how he turned the wheel, the streets didn't change. The same empty road stretched out in front of him. The same blank, featureless faces stared at him from the sidewalk. His heart hammered harder in his chest as he tried again, pulling the car in a different direction. But again, nothing changed. He was stuck. Nate's hands were slick with sweat now, and his mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't stop the car. The street kept looping, always the same, empty, silent, filled with those mannequin-like figures. Every time he turned around, he found himself right back in the same spot. The figures stared, and the whisper kept repeating in his mind, "You're not in your town anymore." It was like he was trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from. Panic swelled inside him. The walls of this twisted world were closing in, and the more he tried to escape, the deeper he sank into it. He didn't know how much longer he could take this. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it would burst. He had to get out. He had to break free from whatever nightmare he was stuck in. Then, in the middle of his panic, something shifted. Maybe it was instinct, maybe desperation, but he turned the wheel hard and headed back toward his house. The road seemed endless, stretching out before him like a never-ending tunnel. The houses he passed looked the same, their windows dark, their streets barren. It felt like he was driving in circles, but somehow, he kept going. The air was thick, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Finally, after what felt like hours, he reached his house. The familiar sight of his home was a brief comfort, but as he pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. The house was silent. Nate's stomach twisted in knots. The front door was still open, just as he'd left it, but there was no sound coming from inside. No footsteps, no creaking floorboards, nothing. He stepped out of the car, his legs weak beneath him, and moved toward the door. The air felt cold, colder than it should have been for a spring evening. When he stepped inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it, but the silence was unbearable. That's when he heard it. The TV flickered on by itself, casting an eerie glow across the room. Nate froze, staring at the screen. It showed footage of his own house from the outside. His heart skipped a beat. He could see himself standing there in the driveway. But the footage wasn't normal. It was distorted, the image glitching and flickering like a broken signal. Suddenly, the screen flashed with a face, twisted, grotesque, like something unnatural. Nate's breath caught in his throat as the voice followed, cold and chilling. "He's seen too much. Let's see what happens next." The words echoed in his mind, making his skin crawl. What did that mean? What was happening to him? A cold shiver ran down his spine as he turned away from the TV. His eyes darted around the room, and then, just like that, he saw it. There, sitting on his couch, was a figure. A person. But it wasn't just any person. It was him. Nate's heart slammed against his chest as he stared at the figure. It was him, his face, his body, his clothes. But something was terribly wrong. The man sitting there wasn't him. It was a twisted version of himself, with an unsettling grin stretched across its face. The smile was wide, too wide, like it wasn't meant to be there at all. Nate couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, but there was no reflection. This wasn't him. This wasn't real. The twisted version of himself didn't speak. It just grinned, its eyes dark and hollow. The silence between them grew unbearable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure stood up. Nate's body froze. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, like the walls were closing in around him. The figure stepped toward him, its grin widening with every step. Nate couldn't tear his eyes away from it. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. The figure kept coming, its presence filling the room with a suffocating weight. Each step it took seemed to make the air feel colder, darker. It was like something was pulling him into this nightmare, drawing him closer to the thing that was meant to be him but wasn't. A twisted, malevolent version of himself. And he had no idea what it wanted or what would happen next. The figure stopped right in front of him, its grin now monstrous. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls pressing in, and Nate's pulse raced as he stood there, unable to move. The air was thick with tension. Every inch of him screamed for escape, but it was too late. The thing was there, and it was just getting started. Nate's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he stood frozen, watching the twisted version of himself slowly advance. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the thing's horrid grin. It wasn't just a grin anymore. It was like something far worse, a grotesque, unnatural thing that shouldn't have existed. Then his phone buzzed. Nate's hand shook as he pulled it out of his pocket, his eyes wide. The message on the screen made his stomach drop. It was a final alert. They know you see them. It's too late. A chill ran through him, colder than anything he had ever felt before. His mind raced. Who was they? What did it mean that it was too late? Before he could process any of it, the power cut out. The house plunged into complete darkness. He couldn't see a thing. The room, the figure, everything vanished into the blackness. But he could feel it, feel the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing in on him, like it was alive, suffocating him. And then the TV flickered back to life. The faint glow from the screen was the only thing that illuminated the room now, but it was distorted, flickering in strange patterns. And on the screen, there it was again, his reflection. But it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a twisted, malevolent version of himself, just like the thing standing before him. It stared at him, its eyes cold and mocking. The reflection's grin widened, a twisted, horrible thing that seemed to stretch farther than it should have. Nate's breath hitched in his throat as he realized something. The reflection was watching him, and it was just as real as the thing standing in front of him. His stomach churned, panic rising again. His body screamed for him to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Then from the dark, he felt something brush against his shoulder. The sensation was cold, sharp like ice. And Nate whipped around, terror flooding his veins. Nothing. There was nothing behind him. But the whispers, they had grown louder. A chorus of voices overlapping, unintelligible, swirling around him. His mind spun with the strange, maddening noise, and he felt himself slipping away, falling into the abyss. The whispers, though, seemed to be saying something. A warning. Run. It was barely a whisper, but it was clear, echoing in his mind like a drumbeat. Nate's eyes shot back to the screen. The twisted version of himself was closer now, its grin wider, its eyes darker. The thing reached out with a hand, slow and deliberate, its fingers stretching toward him. The whispers continued, but they weren't just voices anymore. They were a presence surrounding him. Nate could feel them in the air, swirling, pressing in, suffocating him. He wanted to move. He needed to move. But he was stuck. The air felt thick, like he was breathing through water, and he could barely keep his eyes open as the world around him seemed to close in. And then, the screen cut to black.